The subcommittee will come to order, and we are joined by the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Ed Royce, and I would like to yield to him such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much you holding this hearing. And of course, we have another Zimbabwe election, another Mugabe victory through cheating and strong-arming and harassment. And we've seen this before. I've been in Zimbabwe and seen the ads run by ZANU-PF after they were running cars off the road and killing opposition candidates. And the ad shows a truck smashing into the back of a car saying, I think the gist of it was, driving can be hazardous to your health, but so can voting against ZANU-PF. If it hadn't been mixed with the violence on the ground, you wouldn't know the meaning of that ad. But after enough opposition candidates or people were killed, now this is an election in the past, not the one we're talking about, but what's happening now is more consequential in this election because the unity government has collapsed, the opposition party has been sidelined indefinitely, and ZANU hardliners are in control. And I mean the hardliners. I've talked to those who had second thoughts that were trying to make some change, but they have no input at this point. Mugabe now has unfettered access to all government posts and all state resources, and I think you can expect the graft and the corruption to continue if it's possible to get any more graft and corruption, if it can get worse. Unfortunately, the regional bodies aren't any help, and I have noticed this in the past too in my discussions. The reluctance to say anything critical under any circumstances, the performance of SADC, the Southern African Development Community, has really been a disappointment here, heralded by the administration at the start of the summer as a force for positive change in Zimbabwe. SADC, in my opinion, is still adding to the problem as they've failed in the past to speak out, and this time the parliamentary group assessment of the July elections, I think, terribly missed the mark. Miraculously, they concluded that the elections were, and I'm going to quote from them, a credible reflection of the will of the people, free and fair, is what they said, while civil society organizations that were on the ground that actually saw the elections and other domestic observers found rampant voter roll tampering, political harassment, political intimidation, and for those who have ever seen the results, because I was there on another occasion in a neighboring state, speaking with some of those who had been beaten, had been intimidated, poll watchers, election, party members who were in the opposition. I've seen the consequences of what they've gone through. And this is so disturbing when you consider that SADC financially backed the group's election observer mission. So you would expect, I mean, given SADC's past in this, I just really wonder. The U.S. funded basically a flawed assessment that Mugabe has used to legitimate his continued despotic rule. And I wrote a letter recently to Administrator Shaw expressing my deep concern of USAID's decision to put the money into SADC, given their temerity in the past to speak out in any significant way with regard to human rights or anything else in Zimbabwe. So adding insult to injury, SADC just elected Mugabe as the deputy chair of the regional body for this year and chair for next year. The public statements coming out of the State Department and our embassy in Harare conveyed that our engagement and sanctions policy will depend on the actions taken by a new Mugabe regime, and in particular, his cabinet appointments. Well, that is becoming clear because yesterday Mugabe swore in his 62-member cabinet, a recycling of old ZANU hardliners, the old guard, some of the most militant of the old guard. And the new information minister was the architect of the sweeping law to clamp down on the media, to clamp down on press freedom, The new finance minister was formerly justice minister and responsible for the judicial crackdowns. And frankly, he's already on our sanctions list. So in May, the administration extended an olive branch and eased sanctions on 2 Zimbabwean banks and delisted 3 individuals from the sanctions list. I will be interested to find out if the July election will cause the administration to reevaluate that decision. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and look forward to hearing about what the administration's policy is going to be going forward. And as I said, as being someone who was on the ground in Zimbabwe in the past and has talked to those who were tortured, talked to those who spent their life's work, Africans who spent their life's work trying to get democratic governance, only to be beaten and have their friends killed, it is truly distressing to me, the way the situation we're at right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say to Dr. Smith and to Mr. Romani, I apologize for being a little bit late. Both Ranking Member Bass and I were meeting with a group of Nigerian lawmakers who were in town, led by the chairwoman of the Foreign Relations Committee in their House of Representatives. So, again, I apologize for that lateness in kicking off this hearing. I'm going to wish a good afternoon to everyone. And despite more than a decade of targeted sanctions, Zimbabwe has continued to be a major U.S. trading partner through the generalized system of preferences, even though it has been excluded from the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Chromium, platinum, and diamonds have enriched Zimbabwe's leaders, but not its people. Zimbabwe has been one of Africa's leading industrial powers and agricultural producers until its government diminished the ability of the country to sustain its industrial or ag production. Illegal and disruptive land seizures resulted in political cronies gaining control of productive agricultural land rather than the black farm workers as promised. Agricultural production suffered, dragging down manufacturing of agricultural equipment, the base of the country's industry. The reduction in tax revenues led to a desperate search for foreign funding to stabilize an economy whose inflation rate reached globally historic levels. Nevertheless, Zimbabwe is a major player in southern Africa, even more so now that newly elected President Mugabe has been chosen as Vice President of the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, as Chairman Royce pointed out, and the organization's anticipated chairman next year. Facing international appeals for an end to sanctions on Zimbabwe and threats from the Mugabe government of economic retaliation, the U.S. must devise a policy that safeguards American interests while maintaining our support for democracy, human rights, good governance, and economic development. Today's hearing will examine how the process of policy formation is going now and discuss what that policy should look like at the conclusion of the process. The United States has experienced, as we all know, a troubled relationship with Zimbabwe since this southern African nation achieved majority rule in 1980. Robert Mugabe, the liberation leader who had led his country since 1980, has always resented that our government did not support his war against the previous white minority government. Despite our efforts to establish a mutually beneficial relationship with Mugabe's government over the past couple of decades, his regime has spurned our hand of friendship and flouted international law and convention. Using colonial-era laws as models, Mugabe's government has eliminated the possibility that the political opposition can credibly challenge his rule. It has limited the ability of the media to effectively report on the news of the day. It has restricted civil society advocates from advocating and verifying the many human rights violations that have taken place in Mugabe, Zimbabwe. When Congress passed the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001, it set out a range of aid restrictions requiring U.S. representatives on the boards of international financial institutions to vote against loans or debt cancellations befitting the Zimbabwean government, pending fulfillment of a range of conditions based on repeal of the limitations on the freedoms of the people of Zimbabwe. Recent annual appropriations laws have also barred U.S. support for international loans or grants to the government except to meet basic human needs or to promote democracy. Generally, bilateral aid is prohibited, except that pertaining to health, humanitarian needs, education, or macroeconomic growth. Such prohibitions are maintained unless the Secretary of State certifies that the rule of law has been restored, including respect for ownership and title to property, freedom of speech, and association. However, Mugabe's August 22, 2013 inauguration marked the end of a 5-year period of often uneasy political power sharing with the opposition and partially fulfilled reforms pursued by the government of national unity under the global political agreement. The end of the unity government means that unless a deal is struck with the ruling ZANU-PF party, its former partner in government, the opposition MDC-T party, will likely no longer play a role in executive branch policy making. Past patterns of ZANU-PF governments, along with recent actions by the party officials and the MDC-T's new marginalization, indicate that Zimbabwe may be entering a period characterized by a pattern of unilateral exercise of state power, potentially accompanied by manipulation of the rule of law in its favor, a lack of national political consensus, and the absence of vehicles for alternatives to ZANU-PF policies, continued restrictions on the activities of civil society and opposition activists, including legal and extralegal harassment and violence by both the police and the ZANU-PF supporters, and weak economic growth due to the party's pursuit of a nationalistic economic agenda focusing on state intervention in the economy. The Mugabe government has long blamed the United States and Britain for hampering its economic growth due to sanctions. But aside from direct aid limitations, most sanctions are targeted toward Mugabe and his government leadership. SADC is now calling for a removal of sanctions against Zimbabwe and is being joined by a growing international chorus that includes a few voices from within the Congress in the United States. Meanwhile, President Mugabe has threatened to punish Western firms operating in Zimbabwe unless sanctions are lifted. But questions remain about the willingness of the Mugabe government to take the steps necessary to rescind the U.S. sanctions. If Zimbabwe takes a defiant stand, where does that leave the U.S.-Zimbabwe relationship? The administration has tried limited relaxation of sanctions, only to be met with continued refusal to accept reform. Where does this leave U.S. policy? We have with us today U.S. government officials involved in developing and implementing our nation's policy towards an important nation in Southern Africa. We also have with us civil society observers who will speak to the issues before us as well. Again, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here, for taking the time to give us the benefit of their counsel and wisdom. And I do now yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass.
Mr. Chair, as usual, I want to thank you for holding today's hearing. As a member of the Southern African Development Community, Zimbabwe is an important player in Southern Africa, politically, economically, and socially. I want to recognize and thank today's witnesses for their willingness to come before this committee and assist all of us in better understanding the policy opportunities and challenges toward engaging the Zimbabwean government. This includes the opposition party, the MDC. For today's hearing, I want to focus my comments on two primary areas: good governance and economic growth. We all know that President Mugabe has led Zimbabwe for more than 3 decades. And recently, we witnessed the power-sharing government between ZANU and the MDC. But the uneasy 5-year power-sharing government of national unity has now ended, and it's unclear as to how the MDC will continue to play a governing role. There is no question that MDC's role within the larger government apparatus showed to the world that perhaps an alternative to one-party dominance was possible. As many will recall, the elections of '08 cast a dark shadow in Southern Africa, with government intimidation at many levels, including that of journalists and opposition leaders. There was deep concern over whether Zimbabwe would uphold democratic principles and the rule of law. Questions remain with respect to the most recent election in July, as well as those in '08. The Congressional Research Service reports that Zimbabwe may be entering a new time, and I'm wondering if today's witnesses can comment about that and tell us whether they agree. And that new time would be characterized by unilateral state power, which accompanies the manipulation of the rule of law, where there is a lack of political consensus and the absence of pluralist institutions, where activities of civil society organizations and opposition activists are restricted, and where there is weak economic growth. I recently returned from the AGOA Forum in Addis, where I sat with African leaders eager to tell the U.S. that the development agenda of yesterday must be replaced by a new vision of trade and investment. But we all know that this can't be achieved if governments don't take the necessary steps to create investment climates that attract business, capital, and that spur trade both regionally and globally. This can and must be done by strengthening institutions, but it must also be done by creating political space. Zimbabwe needs strong institutions if it is to join other African nations that have proven year after year that strong economic growth is not only possible but sustainable. Between 2009 and 2011, Zimbabwe saw an expansion of its economy with strong growth in sectors that included mining, services, and agriculture, yet those trends stagnated. The World Bank attributes this economic slowing to poor agricultural seasons, binding credit constraint, fiscal revenue underperformance, and the slow pace of economic reforms. The bank also acknowledged that slow growth was due to continued political uncertainty around the roadmap to elections, resulting in low business confidence and other government-led policies. We know that Africa has the tools and the know-how to solve its own problems. And overwhelmingly, I'm positive about the continent's future, but I'm also sensitive to the fact that in Zimbabwe, despite fairly peaceful elections, still has deep and persistent problems that remain unresolved. A focus on good governance, government accountability, creating legitimate space for opposition parties, and observance of human rights will only strengthen Zimbabwe and its people. I'm confident that with the support of the African Union and the African economic community such as SADC, Zimbabwe's economic, political, and social future can be bright for all its people. And I look forward to today's discussion and the testimony from the witnesses. Thank you very much.
I'd like to now introduce our two distinguished witnesses from the administration, beginning with Dr. Shannon Smith, who was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary for State in the Bureau of African Affairs in May of 2013. Prior to joining the State Department, she served as a Senior Policy Advisor for Africa and Global Health for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2007 to 2013. As a Senior Staffer for Africa, she traveled widely on the continent, leading staff delegations and accompanying the chairman on the Senate side on numerous trips to Sudan and South Sudan during the process leading up to 2011 referendum on independence. Prior to her work in the policy area, Dr. Smith was a history professor. And without objection, the full resumes, which are very distinguished, will be included in the record. We'll then go to Mr. Todd Amani, who is the Senior Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Bureau for Africa. He oversees operations in the Bureau's Office of Development Planning, which provides leadership in policy, outreach strategy, program analysis, and budget. The Office of Management Administrative Staff, which handles personnel assignments, organizational management, and administrative support, and the Office of Southern Africa Affairs. Mr. Romani has been with USAID since 1987 and has served in Egypt, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and most recently Mozambique. Before joining USAID, he was a Peace Corps volunteer, worked in Congress, and was a political science professor. Dr. Smith, if you could proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, thank you for holding this hearing on Zimbabwe and for inviting me to testify before you. We appreciate the deep interest of this committee, and we are pleased to work with Congress in support of our national interests in Zimbabwe and the region. The seriously flawed presidential and parliamentary elections of July 31st were a missed opportunity for Zimbabwe. The United States and other members of the international community had clearly communicated, both publicly and privately, a willingness to consider rolling back sanctions and other restrictions and charting a path toward full normalization of relations if Zimbabwe demonstrated that it was ready to allow its deserving people to freely choose their next government through a fair, peaceful, and credible election. The fundamental challenge the United States faces, now that President Mugabe has been sworn in for another 5-year term, the new parliament has been seated, and a new cabinet has been named, is how best to put into action our long-standing commitment to the Zimbabwean people while maintaining a firm stance against those who continue to undermine democracy and hinder Zimbabwe's progress. The recent elections were a particularly acute disappointment because they followed some encouraging developments earlier this year, when the parties of the former Government of National Unity agreed on a draft constitution, and the Zimbabwean people overwhelmingly approved it in a peaceful referendum. However, in the days and weeks leading up to the election, that promise faded as the electoral process was systematically manipulated. There were serious irregularities in the provision, composition, and distribution of the voters' roll. Political parties had unequal access to state media, and the security sector did not safeguard the electoral process equitably. These problems were highlighted by credible domestic and regional observers. And we were disappointed that the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the African Union chose not to adhere to their own standards or address the irregularities highlighted by their observers in making their determination that elections were free and fair. Secretary Kerry and leaders from other governments noted the deep flaws in the process leading up to the elections and concluded that although generally peaceful, the elections could not be seen as a credible reflection of the will of the Zimbabwean people. Elections are a process, they're not a single-day event, and that process was simply too flawed to be credible. While we are all grateful that polling was not marked by violence this year, the absence of overt violence is not sufficient for the outcome to be considered legitimate. True democracy will come to Zimbabwe only when the Zimbabwean people are free to exercise the rights afforded to them in their new constitution, free of fear and manipulation. President Mugabe and certain elements of his party conducted a sustained campaign of intimidation against civil society organizations, political party members, and ordinary citizens. They allowed partisan conduct by the Zimbabwean media and security sectors, and they made sure the election preparations tilted the playing field heavily in their favor. In doing so, they sent a clear signal to the people of Zimbabwe and the international community that they were more interested in retaining power at all costs than in rejoining the community of democratic nations. U.S. policy reflects the recognition that a select few in Zimbabwe remain committed to maintaining power and wealth at the expense of their people and their nation. We therefore continue to maintain targeted sanctions aimed at those who are actively undermining democracy in Zimbabwe, and thus depriving all its citizens of a more democratic, prosperous future. Currently, the list of specially designated nationals includes 113 individuals and 70 entities. In the future, we may add new names to the list or remove others as conditions warrant. We want all Zimbabweans to know that the United States remains a friend of the Zimbabwean people, and that we make a strong distinction between Zimbabwe's 13 million people as a whole and those few, powerful, self-interested individuals who are degrading the country's future. There are those who argue that we should revisit our sanctions policy because President Mugabe has sought to use U.S. policy as a propaganda tool. We will not be swayed by attempts of President Mugabe and his party to blame Zimbabwe's economic misfortunes and disastrous economic mismanagement on the United States and other governments that maintain targeted sanctions on a select group of individuals and entities. We do, however, want to communicate our message clearly. And those who benefit most from the status quo, influential officials within the Zimbabwean government and the defense and security sectors, will no doubt remain the most vocal critics of U.S. and other Western countries, and they will continue to rely on state domination of the media to perpetuate misperceptions about our policy. With the end of the unity government and the relative stability it had brought to Zimbabwe's economy, there looms the real possibility of substantial economic decline, which President Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party may seek to blame on sanctions. We and Zimbabwe's neighbors alike need to be prepared for the possible humanitarian cost of ZANU-PF's proposed policies. We also need to examine, while maintaining our targeted sanctions, opportunities for engagement with the private sector that are consistent with our values, policies, and interests. In addition to helping to stave off economic hardship for the people of Zimbabwe, such engagement will also provide a powerful counter-argument to the false sanctions narrative that ZANU-PF seeks to wave. We must also remain supportive of civil society groups that advocate for strong democratic institutions, the rule of law, and human rights. And we will look for opportunities to work with elements of parliament and local government as a means of strengthening democratic governance going forward. As my USAID colleague will discuss, We also need to continue our assistance at a humanitarian plus level. We can and we should be proud of our ongoing support for Zimbabwe's progress in the treatment of prevention in HIV/AIDS, in improving the lives of smallholder farmers, and creating opportunities for sustainable livelihoods. Zimbabwe's human and economic potential is enormous, and that makes the events of recent years and the lost opportunities of this election all the more tragic. U.S. policy remains dedicated to helping the people of Zimbabwe achieve the democratic, peaceful, and prosperous future that they deserve. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with your committee, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Mr. Romani.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I appreciate your continued commitment to helping the people of Zimbabwe build a peaceful, stable, and prosperous democracy. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the State Department for their active leadership on these issues as well. Since the political and economic crisis of 2008, Zimbabwe has been in the process of a protracted and difficult transition toward economic normalcy and greater democracy. But the nation's intermittent progress has often been matched by setbacks, which you've noted. While the economy has stabilized, the recent deeply flawed elections represent a disturbing political and democratic departure from the cautious optimism we had after the last elections, which resulted in the formation of the government of national unity and the overwhelming endorsement by the Zimbabwean people of a new constitution. I'd note in response to Chairman Royce's comments about our support for SADC that we ended up not financing SADC, the SADC observation effort. Another donor supported that. We focused our attention on domestic observation and mobilizing voters. And it's that domestic observation that made it clear that this year's elections were neither credible nor free or fair. And they raised concerns about how the United States should continue to support democratic and economic development in Zimbabwe. However, our commitment to the well-being of the Zimbabwean people has not changed. Even if opportunities to pursue broad economic and political reform recede, it is in the interest of the United States to maintain our commitment to helping the Zimbabwean people avert crises and live healthier lives. As a new government is formed, the United States is strategically looking to build on the strong platform of the new Constitution and identify opportunities to enhance transparency, to open democratic spaces, and to support Zimbabweans of goodwill both inside and outside of its institutions, including the nation's next generation of democratic leaders. At the same time, USAID will watch for signs of economic and political backsliding, political repression, and policies that could lead to the types of interrelated shocks and crises that have engulfed Zimbabwe in the past and could pose a threat to regional stability. Going forward, our assistance will focus primarily on humanitarian plus approaches that address key concerns such as food security, nutrition, economic resilience, and health, while helping to promote good governance and economic growth. Through these same channels, USAID will seek out and act upon opportunities to influence policy formation and help develop regulatory systems to support Zimbabweans in their quest for economic prosperity and democratic governance. As Zimbabwe transitions to a new administration in the aftermath of the flawed elections, USAID will closely monitor how its leaders address the challenges facing Zimbabwe and whether they turn their campaign pledges into concrete policies and which priorities will be addressed first. We will follow how the market responds to political developments, signs of political repression, and indication of the politicization of humanitarian assistance. These are all factors that could influence our approach to assistance. They will not, however, affect our commitment to stand by the Zimbabwean people and, through our assistance programs, offer support to those Zimbabweans who are committed to a more democratic and prosperous Zimbabwe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Bass and other members of the subcommittee for your continued commitment that you've shown to the people of Zimbabwe and your support for reform within their government. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romani. Let me begin, Dr. Smith, with you, if I could. The administration decided to loosen the sanctions on the two Zimbabwean financial institutions as a means of encouraging government reforms, and sadly that has not happened. Do you propose to reinstate and then reinstitute those sanctions against those institutions?
We are certainly in the midst of a review of our sanctions policy.
Okay.
In light of the licenses that were granted to the two institutions, including the Agricultural Bank, the goal there was to try and promote access of Zimbabwean small farmers and others to credit and other issues, other forms of support. That we don't think that at the moment we are not planning to impose or remove those licenses, with thinking that the objectives there are still constant, that we still want to support rural livelihoods and other factors. But I would note that the biggest inhibitor to raising capital and to economic progress in general are much more sort of the policies and pronouncements of ZANU-PF than any of our sanctions.
You described or suggested that you clearly communicated international warnings of continued or even expanded sanctions if the July 31st elections were not deemed free and fair. How did those admonitions get conveyed, and how did Mugabe react at the time? And obviously, I think we know how he reacted since.
Earlier this summer, former Ambassador Andrew Young had traveled to Zimbabwe. He had met with President Mugabe, and he had conveyed to him the idea that the opportunity was before them for a new relationship if they chose to seize it by having a free and fair election. That message was conveyed very consistently. We conveyed the same message publicly and privately to members of SADC, to other countries with interest in Zimbabwe, and to the government itself through our embassy and through other officials.
Thank you. Mr. Romani, you did partly, I think, answer the chairman's question, Chairman Royce, but has there been any reassessment given to SADC funding in other areas based on their performance here? What is our sense of that organization now as a result of this?
Can't hear you.
Shannon can probably help answer some of that in terms of our relationship with SADC in a broader sense.
Okay.
As I mentioned, we ended up not using U.S. taxpayer money to fund the SADC observation effort. I think we feel that SADC in the future is an important institution for many reasons, including economic reasons in their efforts at economic integration. It looks like we have some work to do in terms of their observation efforts, and we'd be happy to work with them to improve that.
Okay. Thank you.
I would just echo Todd's comments. I don't think we pulled any punches in expressing our disappointment about either the elections themselves or the evaluation of them. At the same time, SADC is an important institution, and we all have a very strong vested interest in economic stability and political freedom in Zimbabwe, and we hope that we all engage in that now.
Mr. Romani, thank you very much for that. You state that the USAID intends to continue to ensure access to basic health care. This is the same government that in 2005 shut down HIV/AIDS clinics in so-called squatter communities, turning patients into refugees in other countries with AIDS that could no longer be treated with the usual drug therapy. And I'm wondering, are there any signs that the government will allow that kind of intervention by USAID?
We're going to be watching for signs of those kinds of things. We've been working.
But nothing so far, right?
Nothing that we've seen so far. We've been working with technically competent people within the Ministry of Health for many years across administrations. We expect that we'll be able to continue working with those technocrats who are well educated and very competent in the future.
Let me ask you just a question. One of our witnesses later on will be Imani Countess from the Solidarity Center on behalf of the AFL-CIO. And in that testimony, it's pointed out that the ZCTU is comprised of 30 affiliates, over 150 workers. Are any modest union rights that have been achieved in Zimbabwe at risk with Mugabe now getting a fresh, what he will perceive to be a mandate?
I'll have to get back to you on more information about unions. This is the kind of thing that we'll be monitoring as we move forward in our programming to see what happens. At this point, it's very early in the administration.
When, do you have any idea when the reassessment of the, and Dr. Smith, I guess this would be to you, when that policy may be forthcoming?
It's an ongoing conversation, and I'd also note that the list of specially designated nationals it's a living document. It is intended to reflect the realities on the ground and to be aimed at those who are undermining democracy in Zimbabwe. So it's a living organism, if you will.
What is the reaction and what is the status now of the faith community, the churches, the believers, the clerics? Are they at risk? Are they critical of Mugabe? Or are they trying to find some way to preserve what human rights they currently possess for them and for the people?
I think both the faith-based community and civil society more broadly certainly have expressed concerns. At the same time, you know, these are people of remarkable courage and fortitude that they have demonstrated over the years. From the perspective of the U.S. government, I know these are people with whom our embassy and representatives here in Washington want to engage with very closely, and we will rely on, you know, sort of them, but also this is a measure of accountability for the government. What happens with political space, what happens with freedom of religion, what happens with members of the faith-based community, that's the measure of the government as it moves forward.
Are there any bills or pieces of legislation that you see or decrees that you know of that might be a further restriction of religious freedom?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Let me just ask one final question. I remember Andy Natsios once telling me how appalling it was that Mugabe could take what is a breadbasket country that could export to its, was exporting to its neighbors and turn it into a food-deprived and a country in need of imports of foreign aid that happens to be food. Are there any indications that you see, any early warning signs, Mr. Romani, this might be to you, that might suggest you know, there's any crisis on the horizon, food-wise?
There has been a recent vulnerability assessment that's been undertaken in Zimbabwe that indicates that the number of people who will be in need of humanitarian assistance over the next year, over the next the hunger period, which runs from about now through March, is going to be significantly higher than it was a year ago. About a year ago, we thought that 1.6 million people were going to be in need of humanitarian assistance. It looks like 2.2 million will now be in need of humanitarian assistance. Some of that is due to climatic conditions and drought. Some of it is due to poor performance of the agricultural sector, and some of it has to do with the fact that Zimbabwe has used up many of its reserves in responding to previous problems. So it does look like it's getting worse in the short term.
How will that be met? Will the international community rally, including ourselves, to meet that humanitarian need? And is there anything specific, tangible, that you can convey to us so that we have a sense of what our responsibility should be in the Congress?
Right. We're prepared. We're providing assistance through our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and through our Food for Peace programming. So we have already offered $15 million in assistance. We have ongoing programs in the areas affected by the drought to improve economic resilience, and we will be looking at further assistance down the line.
Okay. How much do we provide food aid?
We have a $20 million Food for Peace program. We've offered $15 million in more immediate humanitarian assistance, and we have our ongoing agricultural promotion, Feed the Future kinds of activities.
Now the 1.6 to 2.2 million, when will that When will
This
they
is a
get to
period-
2.2 million people at risk or
This is the hunger
suffering?
period when the stocks are low for families and they're waiting for the new harvest. And so this is a period, as I said, starting about now, that run through March.
March.
And this is the period that we need to be active. We're working very closely with other entities, including the World Food Program and other international organizations, NGOs, and with other donors to respond to it.
Does the World Food Program have a specific appeal out on behalf of this
Yes, We're
600,000?
responding to that.
When did that go out?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'd like to yield to Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This is a general question for both of you. Given our relationship with Zimbabwe, I just wonder how you function there, you know, and specifically for you, Dr. Smith, I'm wondering if the President's initiative around young leaders, if there are leaders that we are engaging with in Zimbabwe, and if so, how? And then, you know what I mean? In other words, the conditions in which they must function. And then in terms of USAID, the same question in terms of how are you able to function in what I imagine would be a rather hostile environment.
I'll leave the operational side more to Todd. But, I mean, Zimbabwe, as you know, as like much of Southern Africa, has an enormous youth population. It's a very vibrant society. It's an increasingly technologically wired up society. And Ambassador Horton there is doing a terrific job of reaching out to youth and to Zimbabweans in general through a variety of communications.
He hasn't blocked the internet?
No, we still have communications there, and it's, you know, I believe Todd said in his opening statement, it's the next generation of democratic leaders too that we very much want to nurture. It's not an easy political environment, but that makes the work even more important.
Why do you think he allows that? I mean, why do you think he allows the internet and hasn't taken steps?
I don't think I could speculate on the motives there, I'm afraid.
I'd note that when I visited Zimbabwe in March, I sat in on what we called a listening session with young leaders in Zimbabwe. I must say it was one of the most moving experiences I've had, was to hear from them, all of whom had faced at some point some sort of an issue, whether they were dealing with HIV/AIDS or had experienced repression based on their political activism, or for whatever reason, but they had responded to that by joining or forming an organization that addressed those issues and joining with other young Zimbabweans to speak out and be clear about what they were facing and their vision for Zimbabwe in the future. So we owe them our support over time, and we're hopeful that through the President Obama's Young African Leaders Initiative, we can provide support to youth. As Shannon mentioned, it's not an easy place to work when it's difficult to work with some institutions, or we don't see the responsiveness to important information. One of the things we've been trying to do on the macroeconomic side, for example, is provide very solid data on what's happening in the economy so that it can serve as a solid basis for decision-making by economic policymakers. And we're hopeful that kind of good data can be used by the current government as well.
Do you know if those young leaders that we're working with, are they at risk? Do they experience harassment, or does it fly under the radar?
Some of them have been victims of harassment. Most of them have had some difficulty in operating like they would like to. But as I said, they seem to have been able to rise above that and continue their work and engage more broadly with other youth and in trying to improve the conditions in Zimbabwe.
And do you see him, from his point of view, having a group of younger leaders that he's grooming? I mean, he's 89. He's, you know, at some point.
I really couldn't comment on that. I don't know.
What'd you say?
I couldn't comment on. I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
I would note the cabinet appointments did not necessarily reflect a youth movement. But
He appointed his peers? Okay, thank you. You mentioned the food program, Mr. Amani, and I was wondering if you could describe a little more about that. Is this food that we export, is it from the United States? Do we buy locally and provide it in Zimbabwe, or what are the specifics?
I'm not sure exactly how we do it in Zimbabwe. I believe that some of the support was for local purchase rather than U.S. food that was shipped there. We can do either in our programs. Much of our program is also focused on building resiliency in families and helping to make sure that the food they have is used so they get the maximum nutritional benefit from it. So we've found that even though sometimes families have access to food, they don't get the full nutrition out of it that they could. So there's a lot of effort to focus on helping families use the foods that's available in the most nutritious ways, and also to just help them build their own stocks, build their own capacity to withstand these kinds of shocks that can happen cyclically at times.
Is that part of Feed the Future, or does Feed the Future function programmatically in Zimbabwe?
Feed the Future does function programmatically. What I was describing is more related to our Food for Peace programs that focus on really the poorest and most at need populations in the country. Feed the Future is focused more on sort of the policy environment for future growth in the agricultural sector. It's focused on some key value chains that have the potential to increase in a significant way the availability of food and to help Zimbabwe be, as Chairman Smith mentioned, the breadbasket, future breadbasket of Southern Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just two very quick questions. It's my understanding that some $700,000 was put into SADC for an election observation. What did they do with it? Did they give it back, or did it get used in some other way?
We send up
escrow?
We send up a congressional notification for that, but ultimately, as I said, we didn't provide that money to SADC.
It never went?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And secondly, we're going to be hearing from Arthur Gwagwa from the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, which I know you're very familiar with. How treacherous is it for human rights organizations and researchers and advocates to operate in Zimbabwe today, as of right now?
It's been a difficult situation for them to work in, and we could provide more information at a separate opportunity, but it is a difficult situation for.
Could you provide that for the record at least? And is that a fear of being arrested, harassed, beaten? You know, I know of what has happened, and I just want to know right now, snapshot today, if I'm a human rights researcher, what are my risks in Zimbabwe?
Snapshot today is uncertain, and I suspect your next witness can probably give you the best read out of all in answer to that question.
Okay.
But it's certainly something we'd be happy to follow up with you and your staff on.
I appreciate that very much. And thank you for your patience and the lateness in starting, and thank you for your insights today. I'd like to now ask unless you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Ranking Member Bass.
I'd like to now invite to the witness table our next two panelists, beginning first with Mr. Arthur Gwagwa, who works as an international advocacy coordinator with the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, a human rights coalition of 19 members, and the first organization in Zimbabwe to also have a presence in the global north. He conducts research and advocates on the human rights situation in Zimbabwe in that role. He works closely with EU structures, the UNHRC, and of course our own government. He is a lawyer by background, duly admitted to practice in both Zimbabwe and in England. Mr. Gwagwa is based in London, but frequently travels to Zimbabwe. Welcome and thank you for making the trip here. We'll then hear from Ms. Imani Countess who is the Africa Region Program Director for the American Center for International Labor Solidarity for the AFL-CIO. She is responsible for the overall programmatic and financial management of the program, which includes activities in 15 African countries. Prior to this position, she served as the Zimbabwe Country Director for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, with responsibility for program development, oversight, and implementation of democracy strengthening programs, donor relations, and representation. Ms. Countess has previously held positions with the Trans-Africa Forum, the American Friends Service Committee Shared Interests, the Africa Policy Information Center, and the U.S. African Development Foundation. Thank you both. Mr. Gwagwa.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Boss, and other committee members for granting me this opportunity to testify before this House. I would request the committee to admit my written testimony together with all the annexures as part of the record.
Well, without objection, all testimonies, any attachments will be made a part of the record.
Sure, thank you. I frequently visit Zimbabwe, and I was in Zimbabwe last week. I traveled extensively around the country. I met all civil society leaders, and I had interviews with members of the diplomatic community, including the United States, Canada, Norway, and SADC diplomats as well. In writing this in a statement, I adopted an evidence-based approach. I did not really express my own opinion, but collected evidence from Zimbabweans about what they are thinking about the situation. So I have clearly set out the views in support of the current measures by the United States of America on Zimbabwe, and I've also clearly set out the views of those Zimbabweans who say the sanctions should be removed. And I've also clearly set out what I call the middle ground of those who are saying, yes, the sanctions should go, but not immediately. In terms of our approach, those who have instructed me to represent Zimbabwe civil society organizations today, we do not really have a very clear position to say, well, USA should take this stance or should take that stance. It's up to the government of America to make that decision based on the evidence that we collected from what the Zimbabweans are saying. But my own assessment of the situation when I went to Zimbabwe recently, and in 2012 and 2011, is that currently it is a country that is going through a very difficult time, where people are whispering their aspirations and expectations and their disappointment with what happened. But they do not really have the freedom to talk about such issues in public for fear of persecution. I should commend the government for holding a violent-free election. That's a huge credit, because not many people were killed, not many people were injured, and not many people were maimed in comparison with previous elections, particularly the 2008 presidential runoff. That's a positive. But the credibility of an election cannot be assessed just on the basis of lack of violence, but other factors that outlined in my statement. And one of the issues is outlined on page 3 of my testimony. That is, the state of compliance with and breach of obligations under international law, treaties and conventions that Zimbabwe is party to. Although cases of politically motivated murders, abductions, disappearances, torture, and intimidation have gone down in comparison to 2008, the situation is still worrying. The military is looming large, and people were not given a chance to express their democratic right to choose a government of their own choice. There are widespread violations and suppression of the right to freedom of association, assembly, movement, exercise of profession, including politically motivated reprisals. I interviewed the barristers who are called advocates in Zimbabwe, and they were actually afraid that maybe the library where we're holding the interview was bugged. They could, if lawyers, top lawyers in a country cannot freely express themselves, I think it's really worrying. Because I'm a lawyer myself who practiced in Zimbabwe for close to 10 years, and I'm a barrister in the UK, and I know how worrying it can be if lawyers are being dragged or being referred to the prosecuting authority by a judge of the High Court simply because they are exercising their right to practice their profession. And some of these young lawyers who are now leading the chambers, I trained them before I left Zimbabwe in 2001. And it is really worrying to see an attack on lawyers. That is an advocate Uriri, advocate Beatrice Mutetwa, and other human rights defenders, including Justina Mukoko, Abel Chikomo, who is the executive director of the forum. Abel Chikomo next week is going to be in court being accused of running an illegal organization, when in fact the law in Zimbabwe actually allows an organization to run on the basis of being a common law entity. It doesn't have to be registered under the Private Organizations Act. At the moment, there are fears that the government might resurrect the NGO bill that might impair and maim the work that we are doing in trying to promote political pluralism. There is widespread violations of freedom of expression, access to information, as seen particularly during the past election, where the MDC requested for the voters' roll in order for them to assert their rights in the electoral court, but that right was denied. There are violations of property rights, and the government continues to make provocative statements that are leading to capital flight. And it is my submission before this committee that if the government of Zimbabwe is serious about re-engagement, it should stop, and I say categorically, stop making provocative statements that are leading the country on a downhill path. And they should stop insults, targeted, towards the diplomatic community. So in terms of the options that are open to the USA, there's a dossier of reasons why, the sanctions, people are saying the sanctions should be removed. But the main reason being that, the sanctions have actually given the regime, tools to keep on, tormenting its people. I spoke to the MDC leaders, they are holding, the same argument. But my view is that when the world is retreating in fear, countries like the United States of America should not cower, but should hold on to its principles and ideals that makes, this nation great. It should stand as a moral leader to fill that particular vacuum that other people of, weak spine are afraid, to fill. So in terms of, my own take, I would go for Senator Clinton's action for action principle, that action for action, because we send a very wrong signal, not only to Zimbabwe, but to the region and to the world, particularly in the current climate of instability, if we were to reward intransigence. What the United States of America should do is to do a balancing act in terms of which they distinguish the state from the nation, safeguarding the economic interests of the nation of Zimbabwe and the people of Zimbabwe, but taking measures, I think, against those who are making, their country of Zimbabwe, to continue suffering. I've outlined, the principles that I believe would actually be very, very relevant in elaborating on the action and action principle. In terms of the areas that I think the United States of America should focus on in terms of supporting Zimbabwe, economic recovery and resilience, that is smallholder farmers, but also ensuring that Zimbabwe diamonds are traded openly on the market in terms of the Kimberley process. Political pluralism, healing and reconciliation, rule of law and justice, citizenship participation, institutional reform and access to services, including access to justice, culture, arts, and information technology. We have seen across the world how information technology can be an impetus in social change, democracy, and advancement of human rights. But we've also seen how information technology can be used by repressive governments in surveilling and oppressing people's rights. So information technology is a very crucial role that I think the United States of America can support. And finally, the issue of culture. Ambassador Bruce Watson is doing a fantastic job in that regard. He started the bicycle diplomacy. I actually happen to be an expert on cultural diplomacy, spoken a lot at the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy in Germany. And I want to see culture to culture interaction between the United States of America and Zimbabwe. We used to have the Loyola University, students coming to Zimbabwe on exchange. I think more of that, so that we have got exchange of ideals and principles that make for a very strong world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Ms. Countess.
Good afternoon. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the Solidarity Center Board of Trustees and staff, thank you for inviting us to testify today. I will give brief remarks on the subject and ask that my written testimony and annexes be submitted.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. For over a decade, the Solidarity Center has worked with trade unions in Zimbabwe to strengthen their capacity to defend worker rights and advocate for sustainable economic policies and human rights protections. We, along with unions in Southern Africa, the AFL-CIO, and its allied organizations here in the U.S., are deeply concerned about the situation in Zimbabwe, and we welcome this opportunity to provide our perspective as a part of this hearing. Since the results of the July 31st elections were released, criticism, including that of our union partners, the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, the ZCTU, and the Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS, has centered primarily on the deeply flawed electoral process. Yet, in the midst of an unclear and highly polarized political environment, it is very easy to lose sight of the dramatic changes that have occurred in the country over the past 5 years, including economic stabilization, largely peaceful elections, and a new constitution that has been endorsed by voters. Affairs have significantly improved from 5 or even 10 years ago, and building on the current strengths can lead to continued improvements in the economy as well as democracy and governance. So while the path ahead may seem troubled, objectively it is somewhat clear. There's a need for continued support for democratic institutions that are independent and that have integrity. Despite what may be seen as a step backward politically, organizations and groups are creating space for independent action and dialogue with an eye toward addressing the yawning social and economic needs of the country. Any analysis of Zimbabwe's way forward has to involve a discussion about how the country is to revive its once strong and diverse economy. And while there is no clear and obvious way forward, there are basic principles and steps that should be beyond dispute. First, the country is blessed with a wealth of strategic minerals, diamonds, and other commodities. However, the wealth generated by them is being utilized in inefficient and corrupt ways. The country's once strong manufacturing and agricultural sectors have steadily withered, and mining is not realizing its job creation potential or helping rebuild the foundation for a stable working class in the country. Zimbabwe has an opportunity to learn from the resource curse from which so many countries have suffered, and to work toward an open, transparent government where any citizen can see where and how natural resources are spent. Yet today, Zimbabwe has no governmental institutions that promote transparency around the use of funds generated by natural resource mining. Zimbabwe clearly needs an economic plan and a trade plan that prioritizes investments in industrialization and job creation. Africa's trade unions have emphasized the need for accelerating industrialization in Africa. They recognize that the current model, based largely on the export of raw extractive minerals, fosters dependencies on Western and Asian markets, which leaves the continent exposed to numerous economic shocks and perpetuates the pattern of jobless growth, leaving Africa less stable and less secure. Last April, I met with the workers at the Rio Zim Empress nickel refinery in Kadoma, a town located about 100 kilometers south of Zimbabwe's capital city, Harare. There, workers emphasized the need to add value to the country's natural resources. One said to me, if Zimbabwe only exported the raw material from which nickel, copper, and cobalt is extracted, the 600 workers at our refinery would be jobless. Those jobs pay between $200 and $1,700 per month and are highly coveted given Zimbabwe's 80% unemployment. The refinery manager is also a strong proponent of industrialization. He is certain that industrialization is the only way to increase local employment. In fact, he says of the current refining process, we should go further. We should produce parts. We have nickel, iron ore, all the minerals one needs to produce alloys required to make parts. That is what we need to do. Today, the refinery produces nickel and copper sheets that are exported to South Africa and Western Europe. In October, the International Labor Organization, ILO, will send a high-level technical team to Zimbabwe to implement recommendations made by a commission of inquiry on respect for freedom of association and the right to bargain collectively because of the country's ongoing and systematic failure to respect freedom of association. Those failures led to the country's inclusion in the June 2013 hearings at the ILO's Committee on Application of Standards as one of the 25 worst countries regarding labor rights violations because it has failed to uphold international labor standards and even failed to ensure compliance with its own national laws. In addition to issues of anti-union discrimination by companies, including state-controlled enterprises, violations include unfair dismissals, non-payment of wages, underpayment of wages, as well as worker harassment and intimidation. Hopefully, the government of Zimbabwe will finally act on the ILO recommendations and demonstrate a willingness to uphold the rule of law, or it can continue to be seen as a major violator of worker rights by the international labor community. As the newly elected government in Zimbabwe has choices, so too does the United States, which is, of course, the reason for this hearing. In terms of policy, the U.S. government has a variety of tools at its disposal that can be used to support rule of law and worker rights in Zimbabwe and to encourage the government of Zimbabwe to do the same. These investments in Zimbabwe's citizens and their institutions have and can continue to produce positive outcomes by leveling the playing field in ways that can lead to a more stable economy and one that ultimately provides benefits to all. Specifically, the U.S. government should continue to actively support civil society institutions that move the dialogue in Zimbabwe and proactively focus on democratic reform, human rights, and absolutely vital economic reforms. Zimbabwe's labor movement and its allies will continue to push for the creation of greater political dialogue on economic reform and discussions between labor, business, and government to move policy actions. It's too early to see if this dialogue will continue in the current economic environment. However, what is clear is that organizations and institutions that are moving these debates in terms of economic reform clearly need continued support. I thank you and welcome your questions.
Ms. Countess. Let me ask you, with regards to the ILO team that's going in October, who do they expect to meet with? Is there a sense that they will be well received, or is this going to be, a very difficult uphill battle for them? And along those same lines, Mr. Gwagwa, you might recall back in 2005, the African Union sent a human rights observer. He got to the airport, and that's about as far as he got. He was sent back. Although a UN researcher, rapporteur, for want of a better word, was sent on the housing issue, and that report was devastating, and it did have an impact in at least exposing, what Mugabe was doing when he was just literally leveling whole stretches of housing. So if you could, the ILO, what are the realistic expectations? Do you know who's heading it for the ILO?
Unfortunately, I don't know who is heading the delegation. I did speak actually earlier this week with ILO representatives who made it very clear that it is their intention to travel in October. It's unclear at this point in time how they will be received. I would speculate, though, I'll sort of go out a little bit on a limb and say that the government will receive them. The government challenged vigorously earlier this summer their inclusion in the current case, and made it very clear that they would like to see things differently. And so I don't have the sense that they would refuse entry to the ILO.
Now, when labor leaders
Yes.
meet with the ILO in country, what risk does that entail? You testify that there's some 150 workers that are part of organized labor.
150,000.
50,000, I'm sorry. Representing 30 affiliates. Has there been growth in union membership or decline? Is it static? And what happens to those who are already part of the union? You mentioned dismissal wages, but is that, for people who are aspiring to become organized and part of a labor union, or people who are currently in a union?
The union membership in Zimbabwe has declined significantly. It's declined because of the virtual collapse of the economy. There's been incredible loss in terms of every sector of the economy: textiles, agricultural production, mining, and so forth. And many of the areas that have seen growth, for example, mining, those unions, for the most part, are not unionized, and the level of violation of basic worker rights is extremely high. In terms of the level of risk, trade unionists, particularly trade union leaders, do experience a high level of risk, without a doubt. They're aware of that risk, and they assume the responsibility for representing workers, and they embrace that responsibility. So they don't run from the risk. In fact, one of our partners said they assume that 1 in 5 of their staff is a part of the security sector and there to inform. And so there is a level of maturity, a level of awareness, but overall a high level of commitment to advancing the cause of worker rights in the country.
Could I just ask you, because I know the South African trade unions have been a great ally of the trade unions in Zimbabwe. Has that influenced the South African government to be more robust in its protestations against?
There are very clear examples in the past of COSATU in particular being able to use its power, its muscle, to change or nudge changes in the policy of the South African government. I think that given the current situation that we're in with the election in Zimbabwe and the response of the South African government, we clearly are at a point in time where there needs to be an intensification of the dialogue between the trade unions of South Africa and Zimbabwe. One of the things that the trade union regional groupings took was able to organize prior to the elections was its own observation mission that included over 20 trade union leaders from about 13 countries. They came, they observed in partnership with the ZCTU, and they came out with a report that was extremely critical, and they applauded the country for the peaceful elections, but noted that there was no possibility for free and fair elections, and that the elections were not credible. So you've got the trade unions in the region who are of an opinion and that the election was not credible, and they have communicated by and large their views to their governments and will continue to do so.
Let me ask you, Mr. Gwagwa, in your testimony you say, now is not the time for the USA to cower or whisper on Zimbabwe or hide Zimbabwe behind the Syrian agenda, which I think is a very important point. Very often we fail to multitask the way we should, and next thing you know, very important abuses and deteriorations in other countries don't get the focus that they ought to. One of the reasons why we're having this hearing today is to keep our focus as a committee and to dialogue with our executive branch, but also to ask your input. But have we made Zimbabwe a sufficient priority in our foreign policy? You did speak very well of our ambassador, and I'm sure he'll be glad to hear that. But if you could elaborate on the overall policy, is it as robust as you would like it to be? Secondly, if you could comment, as I mentioned a moment ago, about is it time for the AU? In 2005, the human rights officer tried to get in, didn't get in, to resend a person to observe human rights. It might have a chilling effect even on any deterioration. Just like I do believe the ILO mission will have nothing but positive impact going forward. And you did speak of flight post-election. Are those properties then confiscated by the government when people leave? And how widespread is that? Are people really uprooting and leaving out of fear? If you could.
In terms of the U.S. policy, well, I think the U.S. has really been doing enough because there are other fishes to fry, and we can't expect the U.S. to be putting all its focus on Zimbabwe when there are people dying in Syria, in Egypt, and other nations of the world. But the overall impression is that Zimbabwe is a slow-burning situation, which is why it is in the back burner of many countries' foreign policies, because you can't compare Zimbabwe to Syria, you can't compare it to Egypt, because you don't see people dying in the streets. You don't see a lot of people being, because there are factors or the situation, the factors in Syria, Egypt, and Zimbabwe are totally different, because Zimbabweans are peace-loving people. We are long-suffering, and we know what happened between 1965 and 1980. We are not a fighting country, but it does not mean that we are not angry. So because of that, it's a slow-burning situation. Sometimes people say, well, they are better countries to be focusing on. But in terms of regional stability and in terms of within the SADC, I actually think there should be more focus on Zimbabwe, because I've seen reactive foreign policies where governments want to go and quench wars instead of taking preventative measures so that such atrocities do not take place in the first place. So yes, the U.S. has been doing, but it could do better in terms of engagement. And number two, the issue of sending another representative. Zimbabwe has been notoriously known, even at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Sorry, where I say UNHRC, it's supposed to be United Nations Human Rights Council, for ignoring requests for visits, special rapporteurs. In 2010, the story of Manfred Novak, who was deported at the airport. And we work with special rapporteurs. Most of them have been ignored. And I actually think it's high time we had special rapporteur, for example, on independence of judges and lawyers to visit the country. And then third question on the human rights violations, there was serious escalation from August 2012 to about May, June. But the reason why there was a lull, or sort of like a retreat by the government in terms of the attack on human rights defenders, was that they switched their attention from attacking human rights defenders to electoral manipulation. We began to see subtle intimidation, judicial complicity, where if a judge attacks you, you can't say anything in public because you'll be done for contempt of court. So it became more subtle, because it's the tools of trade that the government, they employed new tools. But now we see a rise in attacks again, and I could talk of maybe the MDC's organizing secretary, Morgan Komichi, whose crime was simply that he picked a ballot paper and he gave it to the Election Commission. He's languishing in detention. Justina Mukoko, your organization is facing delisting. Zimbabwe Human Rights Forum is facing attacks. Even Morgan Tsvangirai himself, last week at the funeral of Enos Ngala in Buhera, the leader of the war veterans said Tsvangirai should not return to his rural home. That's really scary. So in terms of the attacks, there is a lot of intimidation, and it is likely to increase unless something is done. Thank you.
Has any request been made to the UN to investigate this intimidation of lawyers and judges? Because we could do that here as a committee, and certainly join you if that's something we could do. Collaborate with you.
We in the past, because our organization was actually responsible for, I was part of the team that lobbied, discussed with Patrick Chinamasa that Navi Pillay to visit Zimbabwe in May 2012. I was part of the negotiations, but we have requested, what we have done is, because the government rejects the applications for country visits, so what we end up doing is we invite the special rapporteurs to attend our annual events, particularly the International Human Rights Day in 10 December. But the downside to that is that if they are invited for a working, which is a working arrangement, because they haven't been invited by the government, they cannot comment on the situation in the country. They can only make anecdotal references.
I see.
So I think there's actually need. If the government is saying is committed to reforms, what are they afraid of? I actually think, the special rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers should come into the country, and then also Frank LaRue, the special rapporteur on the right to freedom of expression, which is the mandate that also covers elections and access to information.
One last question before yielding to Ms. Bass. When is the Zimbabwe's periodic review at the Human Rights Council? Is that coming up anytime soon?
I actually happen to be part of the civil society team, that does that. Zimbabwe was reviewed in October 2011, and the report was adopted on the 12th of March last year, 2012. So the midterm review is going to be in March of next year. So the government is preparing for that, and we are preparing for that. And thank goodness we have been working quite well with the government on that in terms of the UPR, because the UPR doesn't threaten the government. Minister Patrick Chinamasa has been doing a fantastic job. We'll wait to see how Emerson Mnangagwa is going to cooperate with civil society. But I'm going to be having a Skype interview with the United Nations next week on maybe strategic areas where I think we need support. So I couldn't go to the Human Rights Council session, which is undergoing as we speak because of this commitment, but we have a Skype interview to discuss strategy in terms of where the country goes from now.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions and wanted to know your opinion, both of you, about the African Union and the African Union's, emphasis and discussion about governance, supporting, promoting good governance, and also, maybe a new tenure in the AU where they, in the past, had wanted to have real hands-off on governments. And I'm wondering, do you see the role being any different in Zimbabwe? I understand that the AU accepted the results of the elections, but I mean more in terms of supporting the development of better governance in Zimbabwe.
My colleague first.
It's a really difficult question. Because what we all saw in terms of both the AU and SADC and South Africa's response to the elections is that these bodies and South Africa as a country have prioritized the peace in terms of an absence of violence. And it's very difficult moving forward to see to what extent these international bodies and countries can be encouraged to prioritize accountability. Already, within just a matter of weeks, I do know that some civil society organizations and trade unions in Southern Africa have organized a new network, a network that is designed to pressure SADC to be more accountable to the will of the majority of the peoples of the region. It's called the SADC We Want. And it's new, and it's just rolling out its agenda, and it's unclear what impact it will have. But what I do believe, and it's echoed in my comments, is that the only way in which we can see an increased accountability of AU, SADC, South Africa, and other governments is through citizen engagement and citizen power, including worker power. And until we get more of that,
Right.
it's not clear.
Got it.
Just briefly, I support what she's saying because I think particularly SADC places relationships above principles. Although there have been change in government in different SADC countries, but the issue of liberation, war, solidarity still looms large in the region, and also the culture of patriarchy, where you cannot be seen to disrespect your elders. Even us, I think within civil society, we face, the same issue. You meet Zimbabwean, even diplomats across the world. They say, young men, who do you think you are? But, the world is changing. I'm same age with David Cameron, George Osborne, and maybe even President Obama. And so the world is changing. I think African leaders have to change in terms of, their cultural paradigm, right, that you need white hair in order for you to be a leader. AU is still problematic as well. Mrs. Dlamini Zuma, when she went to Zimbabwe prior to the elections, she was partisan. She was clearly, pro-ZANU-PF, because, she's part of that, liberation, movement. Yeah. We see what happened when the Foreign Affairs advisor to Jacob Zuma wanted to be outspoken regarding what was happening in Zimbabwe, how she was, silenced, and how Botswana is, being sidelined as a result of his unprincipled stance. But I see signs of change across Africa, through social change, which is, being prompted by ICTs and, globalization. I see young people, driving social change. So I think there's need for investment in that regard. And there are also structures like the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. Although some commissioners maybe believe in their old, maybe, shall I say, patriarchy and all that, but I see quite a diversification in terms of commissioners. Commissioners who are really committed, to human rights within. So I think working with the African Commission, African Court for Human Rights, and other structures within the African Union can actually help to support, the cause for good governance and democracy. But above all, we need social change. That is investment in social change projects, participatory democracy projects, that empower citizens and reinvigorate, democracy in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. And then a final question is about the impact of U.S. sanctions now, whether or not they, well, one, what you think of the impact and how you have seen the impact on the ground, but two, what do you think needs to be changed? Should it be increased, expanded, decreased, what?
Well, to be honest, my organization doesn't have a view on sanctions. And we also do not usually want to talk about it. I think partly because of fear that you can actually be banned from Zimbabwe as a result of talking about sanctions. So I won't say a view because we don't have a stance on the issue of sanctions, but I provided a dossier of what Zimbabweans are saying on sanctions, from page, it's page 19 to 21. There's strong view that the sanctions should go, but not because there have been reforms in Zimbabwe, but the major reason is that some people actually think that the sanctions have actually helped the government to, because the issue about the government is that they are cushioned by diamond revenues, and their children continue to go to Western universities and to good schools like St. George's, Prince Edward, those top schools within the country. So in terms of real impact on the politicians, it has been very minimal. But, and there are other reasons again that the bureaucrats, who preside our institutions like Zimbabwe Election Commission, the High Court, and all that, those people were affected by sanctions. Maybe not really affected, but some of them were affected by sanctions. Maybe they saw their standard of living maybe going down. So they can never forgive the West, I think, on the issue of sanctions. So the danger is that when we want to work with them, they might say, well, we don't want to work with you because you guys, you push for sanctions. So in other words, the agenda for institutional reform is going to be very difficult in the presence of sanctions, because expecting the same people to reform institutions is not different from expecting a monkey to preside over an agenda to abolish a forest. Because in other words, they're saying reform the institutions, but they are sanctions.
Right.
So my personal view is that to they should go. It is a difficult view, but I think maybe they should go not to appease the government.
No, you're saying because it's a rally point for the government.
Yeah, because it's a rallying point for the government.
I understand.
I would just want to echo what has just been said. The sanctions really have very little impact. I mean, we're talking about travel restrictions on 100 or so people, and commercial licensing restrictions on a handful of enterprises. They don't have a significant impact on the country. They're essentially a red herring. They're used by the government of Zimbabwe to, as a real rallying point, they enable the government to use the West as sort of like the whipping boy. The previous ambassador used to really challenge the government of Zimbabwe on this question of sanctions, and he would remind the government that during the colonial era, when Rhodesia was sanctioned, the U.S. imposed chrome sanctions and other sanctions against the government of Rhodesia. Rhodesian economy actually grew because they were forced to do more with less. And so, again, the previous ambassador would kind of throw that back, and without much response. I don't want to speak on behalf of the trade unions of Zimbabwe, but having lived there for several years, what I can certainly say, based on my personal experience, is that there's very little impact.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Ms. Bass, thank you. Mr. Guagua, and thank you, Ms. Countess, for your very, very enlightening, very incisive answers, your testimony. It really does help this committee, and I hope it helps all listeners, including in the administration, who benefit from your counsel. I won't ask you for an answer because you did give a very elaborate answer on sanctions. It has been my belief for a long time that sanctions that are even more micro-targeted. I have a bill pending right now called Jacob's Law that seeks to hold human rights abusers accountable. It's even more narrow if they abuse American citizens, although the Magnitsky Act was one of those vis-a-vis Russia that seeks to pick out individuals, and if they're complicit in crimes, human rights abuse, they and they alone are the ones, not a more blanket sanction. And I think we are trending in human rights policy towards more of that, because that is a more effective way of doing it. And so, but I do thank you for your testimonies. They were extraordinary. If you have anything you want to add before we conclude? Yes, Mr. Barber.
Yeah. All I can say is I think the issue of sanctions is entirely up to your government, to make a decision on that. But I think, as you have said, I think maybe a new approach. We have been working with the EU on that. I think a much more responsive approach, which is based on compassion, I think, for the people, because politicians are politicians all across the world. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they've got their own narrow agendas, but it's a question of maybe how do you look beyond politicians and have compassion for the people who are behind. But it's a difficult balancing act.
Very difficult.
No one could ever get it right. The EU is struggling with the same question.
Oh, it's a very tough question. I've been here 33 years. I voted to impose sanctions on South Africa. As a matter of fact, in this room, when we had that vote, I was the only Republican who voted for it. But there were people, including the Reagan administration, who argued it would hurt the average South African even more. And I didn't dismiss that argument. I thought it had some validity, but apartheid was such an abomination that it seemed a more blanket sanction was warranted. But they're tough calls. So I do thank you again for your insights on all things related today. And without any further ado, the hearing is adjourned.